Hello. Hi. Um, I've been talking to a lot of new people recently, and the question always comes up when I tell them that I have a master's in philosophy, or a background in philosophy rather. The question always comes up: why is philosophy useful? What can you do with it? Why did you study it? What can you be? Right? And it's a good question, and especially when it's phrased like that, it's often very a philosopher would point out that you have a lot of uh, inbuilt, what would you say, assumptions into the statement, such as an educational program has to be directed towards like a professional activity, and that a use is self-evidently obvious or translatable into like commerce. And if you point any of these things out, like I'm doing now, it sounds like you're evading the question. The question begging is at that level. But I figured I would actually try to play that game linguistically and sort of speak to that question, that the the concerns behind that question. What is philosophy good for, right? So etymologically, philosophy, philos, sophia, is a Greek word which means sophia is love, and philos is it's something like knowledge or wisdom, one of those two. And obviously, Greek language scholars can uh, critique my rudimentary etymology, but it captures something of an essence. Philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom or the pursuit of knowledge. It's essentially the search for tools in the quest for living what the ancient Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, the literary figure of Socrates would call the good life. So philosophy are what you do once you have the Maslow hierarchy of needs model. Once you have the basic elements for survival, the question becomes, how do I live a good life, right? Not just how do I attain whatever momentary goal-oriented activity that has arisen, right? Pursuit of money or pursuit of fame or pursuit of romantic involvement, but how do I structure my life so that it's a good life? It's more than just content life. It's something like not necessarily a spiritual quest, but something like an educational pursuit of what we would later term enlightenment. And so that's a really good, for me, that's a good way of defining philosophy. Now, you can also define philosophy as what it turned into, which was the pursuit of knowledge. And science started out as natural philosophy, right? So that sort of branch, that sort of Western, I shouldn't even say Western, but that sort of human pursuit of reason and logic and like establishing facts based on evidence, or at least on argumentation based in coherent logic, that sort of grew into science. And then since the Enlightenment, since the change of philosophy from a all-encompassing discipline into pursuit of knowledge, into sort of these sub-disciplines for specializations, right? Psychology, physics, mathematics, purely defined, chemistry, all these sort of biology. Aristotle was a great biologist. He was really curious about the natural world and he did a lot of experimentation on animals. He was a scientific mind, but Aristotle was for the longest time called the philosopher because he was just that encompassing. And other commentators have pointed out that all of Western philosophy are footnotes to Plato. So whether you agree with those two statements or not, the point is that those two thinkers have been predominant in shaping the philosophical mind. But the question comes back. What do you as a 21st century person do with philosophy, right? Besides teaching philosophy. And it's sort of, you don't, you live a life that is not subject to the whims of conditioning that is not in your interest. So you don't blindly follow trends of consumer capitalism. Nothing wrong with capitalism, but you don't fall for a preset life model prescribed to you by some company or some ad structure, some ads, some advertisement, sort of constructed narrative. You don't fall for those. Your pursuit of what is good and authentic for you becomes first and foremost in your life. At least it can. With philosophy, you have that option. You have the option of not being subject to the whims of fate in the same way. Now, you can go into Stoicism specifically, or you can find refuge from the turmoil of the world in more rationalistic disciplines. Analytical philosophy, the philosophy of language, these intellectual structures help you understand the world better. You learn how to construct your arguments, your thoughts. You learn how to separate facts and opinion and values and information. You learn how to discern and navigate. It's very useful if you want to be a knowledge worker. Very, very useful. It's like philosophy is like a toolkit. And all the tools that you need to ascend to a higher state of your own attainment, a higher state of your own flourishing, all the tools are there. Like, philosophers have accumulated these mind tools, these sort of cognitive ways of viewing the world, these perspectives, these elementary truths, these skeptical tendencies, right? The questions such as what is knowledge, not just how do you know something good enough to realistically assume that taking that action will lead to that outcome. That's not knowledge. Knowledge is more like it's very hard to define knowledge, and philosophers have tried for a long time to do it. And learning about the epistemology, learning about the pursuit of knowledge is very, very useful for knowledge work. But like, how do you know that something is true, and what would that even mean? Normally, when you say something is true, what you're saying is that if I act in accordance with it, I get what I want. But that's not necessarily, like, the statement may or may not be true. It might be adaptive. It might function in the world, but it might turn out at some later principle to be not the whole picture, not a complete picture. Take Newton's theory of gravity, right? It works. You can go to the moon with it. It's very effective. It seems to predict the world, and if you act according to it, you can get really cool results. But it's not true. It's not complete. It's not the whole story. The Einsteinian paradigm replaced the Newtonian paradigm. We now know that gravity is caused by the bending and warping of space-time, and not the attraction of larger bodies. So this is what Kuhn would call a paradigm shift. You can look that up more. Philosophy of science is another area. It's extremely useful. So philosophy, it doesn't just help you sound well articulated. It also helps you think. Like, it treats you as central, not just as consumer or provider or not as an atomized being that serves some larger scheme, a political figure or a voter or it allows you to explore your existence and not be confined into rigid identities that are pre-prescribed to you. And that might sound, what do you mean by that word salad? Well, have you ever felt like something was off with the world? Like something wasn't adding up, and the story you were being told by financially motivated actors weren't necessarily the whole truth? Well, philosophy is a sensible way of critically and accumulatively investigate the claims. It teaches you the tools for you to critically assess what other people are telling you. It's not about learning a new story. It's not about learning a more correct way of being. It's about getting the tools to make your own correct story. And I worry that our skepticism towards philosophy reflects the old adage, right? Quo bono, who benefits? Who benefits from you being informed and critical, able to critically think and articulate yourself? You. Who doesn't benefit from that? Well, everyone trying to sell you or something or use you for an agenda. So I worry that the mainstream pushback to philosophy, or the sort of like, oh, what's that good for, sort of energy, that's been honed, let's say, by an educational system that isn't too occupied in teaching people to think, much as it's trying to teach people how to interpret, if that makes sense. Like you're given a broad, generalized cultural narrative, and I know all the problems with the educational system is, there's resources, there's actually just how do you educate people? It's a personal responsibility. That's why you have to read philosophy. But the skepticism towards philosophy as useful today, that's been cultivated. I do believe that that's been systematically cultivated. I also think it's genetically based, that we sort of, there's a lot of psychological experiments showing that in-group behavior will be reinforced, and that critical thinking is social adaptation seems to be favored over individual thinking in small tribes, especially of lower order primates like chimpanzees. But the need for you to inform yourself, especially in a post-truth era, whatever that is, it's big. And you'd be better off having tools from philosophy than not having them. And there's a lot of great intro to philosophy books. You don't have to read Nietzsche right away. You don't have to read Dostoevsky. You don't have to read Wittgenstein. You don't have to read any of these complex, sophisticated philosophers. You can read intro books just teaching your mind how to critically evaluate your way of thinking. Norway has philosophy as an obligatory university course. And Norway is also one of the most well-educated and most prosperous countries in the world. And there's some science, I can't link to it, unfortunately. It's been lost to the grips of time, but I read this article that one of the reasons Norway has been able to invest their oil money and grow so quickly from a an industrial area economy to today is because they have had mandatory philosophical introduction. And it sounds like a far-fetched claim, right? Yeah, sure. But there's something about learning when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, that the way you're thinking right now, the way you've been brought up to like run narratives, isn't necessarily true. It might be true. You might luck out and have the right narrative, but it's not necessarily true. And just learning that my way of seeing the world can be incorrect, you're immediately, the brain sort of learns heuristically that it can fall into all these different cognitive prejudices. Now, it might not be able to articulate it, but it's sort of like seeing a black swan. You only need to see the one to realize, oh, there can be other colored swans. It's the same thing with philosophy. You just need to learn once or twice that, okay, there are other ways of validly interpreting the world besides my own. And then you might not need to specialize in philosophy. You can, and you probably should, but you don't need to. And that's why I think philosophy is really crucial. So, okay, I might have sold some of you on the concept that philosophy is, is a useful thing. It's something like mindfulness. It's something you should do for your own development, but, whatever. Maybe I've convinced you thoroughly to check out some introduction to philosophy courses. Maybe you want to grow into there's something in you that you feel needs to be expressed, and you need the tools to know how to pursue that. That would be a philosophical pursuit. It would be extracurricular to your professional competency. Okay. But what about professional philosophy? What about academic professors? What about people with master's degree and postdoc and doctorates? Why do we need that? Well, that is a different question, but the answer is research. Philosophy didn't stop when the Renaissance hit, when the scientific revolution hit, and it hasn't stopped since. There's a lot of questions still to be investigated, deep questions. How should you live? What is ethically right of you to do? Why is it ethically right? There's a lot of questions, and philosophy is in no short supply of difficult questions. They are in a short supply of people contributing, actually. You'd think in a world where food and all sorts of resources are sort of managed, we can house everyone more or less. We can, in theory. There's enough houses, right? And we can feed everyone more or less. You'd think that the pursuit of the populace would be philosophy, art, theater, the full cultivation of human qualities, right? And I think it can be. I really do. I really sincerely believe that the individual, not the group, not the collective, but the individuals that make up the collective, once they are informed of the sincerity of their needs, of the needs for philosophy, can and will pursue it. But they have to internalize that desire, the desire to grow. You just need to see that there's a way to do that, and then people will do it en masse. But the objection might be raised, like, okay, if it's so easy, why don't everyone just do it? It's a good criticism. I happen to think that people don't do it for a variety of complicated socio-cultural reasons, which is why partly I'm making this video on this YouTube channel, because I want to teach people that teaching yourself to think is very useful, not just vaguely useful for some. It's not going to improve your resume, but it's going to improve your ability to understand what is important to focus on, if that makes sense. Like your ability to set long-term goals, and the self that makes long-term goals will be able to set better, and then that new self can set better, and so on. It's a continual, but you need to start with getting the philosophical tools like critical thought and understanding the ideological history of your culture, of your society. How did we get to the point where everyone is equal before the law? How did we get to the point where men and women are treated equally? Like, that didn't just happen. That came about through centuries of meticulous argumentation by a lot of people, good people, smarter people than I will ever be. And these people left their best insights. They left the cream of their intellectual achievements. They left them for us in small or large tomes that we can just read and learn how to be better, to exist in a better way. And you can't put a price on that. I mean, if you've ever been miserable at work, that misery is the payment for not having a philosophical schema that incorporates all aspects of your work experience. So, yes, you can make money without philosophy, but I would argue you can't make satisfaction without philosophy, if that makes sense. If you've ever been satisfied, it's because you've used your own philosophical capacity to appreciate life in its givenness. So that's a lengthy rant, and there's a lot of ways to subdivide all of this, but I think that mostly is it. It's hard to explain how your mind will expand, because it's your mind. It will or your neurological wiring. It'll expand in its own capacity. I can give examples from my life, reading Kant and teaching myself that the difference between what you perceive and what is actually there might be different. There's a lot. The ethics of utilitarianism and pragmatism and consequentialism. There's a lot of deontology. There's just ontology, formal ontology, what exists, what does it mean to exist, metaphysics. There's a lot of really interesting questions in philosophy. Really interesting, way more interesting than social media. Trust me, really way more interesting. But you have to cultivate the taste for it, the interest in it. So, if nothing else, I wanted to encourage you to reflect on what philosophy is and what it's hard to say what philosophy isn't. Sometimes people say we don't need philosophy, right? But they're using their philosophical framework on the world to make that statement. They say that, okay, positive materialism is sufficient and we don't need to think about it anymore. That's a philosophical argument. Like, that's a philosophical statement. You can't help but contribute in philosophy as long as you have a functioning nervous system that interprets the world and acts in it. You're already engaged in philosophy, but it's just very unsophisticated. And the degree to which your philosophy is unsophisticated is the degree to which you run into suffering. And if you're interested in not suffering, then philosophy is for you. Okay. That's it. Hope you enjoyed this video. And don't hit subscribe and don't like this video. Keep this on the down low. Okay? Thanks.